They told you taxing billionaires would fix the system. They told you electrifying everything would make life cleaner, cheaper, and more efficient. They told you higher taxes and tighter regulations would build stronger, more equitable economies. And now, even Democrats in California aren't sold on their own tax plan. Seattle can't guarantee the lights stay on if demand spikes. And businesses across Oregon are saying the cost of staying open is becoming impossible. At some point, you have to ask a very simple question. Is this bad luck, or is this what happens when ideology replaces reality? From Seattle to Los Angeles, this is Left Coast News. No apologies, just the truth. California, when tax the rich stops being simple. Let's start in California, where the proposed Billionaire Tax Act is being sold as a quick fix for a roughly $100 billion hole tied to healthcare funding gaps. On paper, it sounds politically bulletproof. A one-time 5% tax on about 200 billionaires, spread it out over 5 years, fund Medi-Cal, save hospitals, call it a win. Except the people you'd expect to be cheering the loudest aren't. Even inside the Democratic coalition, there's hesitation. Labor unions are split, progressive lawmakers are dodging the question, and Gavin Newsom isn't exactly hiding his opposition. Why? Because once you get past the slogan, the mechanics look like a legal and logistical minefield. The state has no existing system to tax wealth, only income. There's no federal framework to piggyback on, which means California would be flying blind. Valuing assets like private businesses, art, and real estate at that level is, let's just say, subjective if you're being polite. And yes, the quiet fear, capital flight. Even critics on the left are saying the same thing in more polite language. If you build a system that's unpredictable, legally shaky, and targeted at a tiny group with the most mobility, they leave, restructure, or outmaneuver it. And then what? You don't just lose the new tax revenue, you risk shrinking the existing tax base that already funds the state. That's not some fringe argument. California already relies heavily on top earners for income tax revenue. You destabilize that and the whole budget starts wobbling. Now you've got a situation where the policy checks the ideological box, but the people responsible for actually governing are quietly wondering if it detonates something bigger. Seattle. Electrification meets reality. Now shift north to Seattle, where the conversation isn't about taxing wealth, it's about whether the lights stay on. Seattle City Light is warning it may not be able to meet the future demand. Not in some distant theoretical future, we're talking near-term strain. Here's what's coming. Proposed data centers requiring 369 megawatts of power. That's roughly 1/3 of Seattle's current daily electricity usage. Regional demand expected to nearly double by 2033, and at the same time, the city and state are pushing aggressive electrification policies, electric vehicle mandates, building electrification, phasing out natural gas infrastructure, all of which increase demand. And the utilities' response? They're short on engineers, short on project managers, already burned through reserves buying expensive power during drought conditions. Now rewriting contracts to push infrastructure costs onto private companies. Translation, they don't have the capacity and they don't have the margin for error. So while policy is pushing people towards total dependence on the grid itself is admitting it's not ready. That's not a political talking point, that's basic systems math. If demand grows faster than supply and infrastructure, something gives. And historically, what gives first is reliability and price. So you end up with higher rates and a system that's more fragile, not less. Now down to Oregon, the slow squeeze on business. Then there's Oregon, where the problem isn't theoretical anymore. It's showing up in surveys, hiring struggles, and businesses quietly folding or relocating. A state-backed survey tied to the governor's Prosperity Council paints a pretty blunt picture. Nearly half of respondents cite high taxes and regulatory costs as the biggest barrier. Businesses say they can't find skilled workers. Rural communities are dealing with infrastructure gaps like poor internet and roads. Urban areas are dealing with housing costs so high employees can't afford to live near their jobs. And then you've got policy layering on top of that. Tina Kotek is considering legislation that would block certain federal tax cuts from reaching businesses. So at that exact moment, businesses are saying, we're getting crushed on costs. The response is to potentially increase their burden. And if you agree with the intent, the timing is questionable if your goal is keeping businesses alive. There's also a growing divide inside the state. Portland-driven policy priorities, rural communities feeling ignored and economically stranded. That split matters because economies don't collapse all at once, they hollow out. First slowly, then all at once when the tipping point hits. The through line nobody wants to admit. Here's the common thread across all three. In California, policymakers are trying to retrofit revenue after spending commitments are already baked in. In Seattle, leaders are pushing demand-heavy policy without matching infrastructure readiness. And in Oregon, the state is adding pressure to a system already showing signs of strain. Different policies, same structural issue. Decisions are being made based on how things should work, not how they actually function under pressure. And from a constitutional small government lens, this is where people start raising eyebrows for a reason. When government grows faster than its ability to manage systems responsibly, you don't just get inefficiency, you get instability. Not overnight, not dramatically, just enough friction, cost, and uncertainty that people and businesses start adjusting their behavior. They move, they downsize, they stop investing. And once that starts, it's incredibly hard to reverse. You can call these three separate stories if you want, or you can call it what it looks like, a regional stress test. And the early results aren't exactly confidence-inspiring. So step back and look at the bigger picture. In California, leaders are scrambling to backfill massive budget gaps with a tax even their own side doesn't fully trust. In Seattle, they're pushing full speed into electrification while the grid quietly waves a red flag. And in Oregon, businesses are telling anyone who will listen that the cost of operating is becoming unsustainable while policy keeps tightening the vice. Different headlines, same underlying issue. When policy ignores basic economics, infrastructure limits, and human behavior, reality eventually forces the correction. And the people who feel that correction first aren't politicians or billionaires. It's regular workers, small business owners, and families trying to stay afloat while the rules keep changing. If you live in California, Seattle, or Oregon, you're basically watching a live stress test of policy versus reality. Billionaire tax that even progressives are hesitant to back, power grid warnings while electrification ramps up, businesses saying they can't survive under current costs. At what point do we admit something isn't working? Drop your stay below and tell me what you are seeing on the ground. Are things getting better, or are they getting harder to afford and operate? Let's compare notes. At this point, California is trying to tax its way out of a spending problem. Seattle is betting the grid won't blink while demand explodes, and Oregon is squeezing businesses and acting surprised they're gasping for air. It's like watching three different people try to fix a leaking roof by arguing about the color of the bucket. Anyway, that's my take. Be sure to follow us on social media, YouTube, Brighteon, Rumble, BitChute, and all the others. Please share with somebody who hasn't woken up to this yet. Thanks for watching.